Welcome to the first Newlin series program of 2022, everyone. My name is Laura Ady. I'm the Programs and Administration Manager at Newlin Gristmill. For those of you who aren't familiar with the site, we are a privately run nonprofit park in Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, and the site includes 160 acres of land with over 8 miles of trails and a historic area with our 1704 grist mill at its center. And the Newlin series is a way for us to explore topics that relate to our dual mission of history and nature and feature both outside experts and Newlin gristmill staff. And this year's Newlin series is sponsored by Team Toyota of Glen Mills, so we thank them for their support. If you have questions during the talk, please type them into the Q&A and I will read them out for our speaker at the end. We'll hold questions till the end and do a Q&A then. Tonight's talk was inspired by a recent project that the site has undertaken. We worked with Concord Township and they had the assistance of Moore Construction in documenting and disassembling an original 18th century log building on what was historically a Newlin property in the township. It's currently being stored off-site, but it will be reconstructed in the historic area of the park in the next few years. So as a way of getting everyone acquainted with log buildings, we've brought in someone who kind of literally wrote the book, at least the National Park Service Guide on Historic Log Construction. So please join me in welcoming Bruce D. Bomberger. He is currently the archivist for the Lebanon County, Pennsylvania Historical Society. And Bruce, I'll go ahead and turn things over to you for the program.
Okay, thank you. I thought what I would first do, I should say, good evening, folks, is just tell you a little story about how I came to write this, which I think you'll find interesting. I wrote this back in 1991, 91. I think it was published in 91. And I was working in the Bureau for Historic Preservation, which is Pennsylvania's State Historic Preservation Office at the time. I haven't worked in that office since 1997. After that, I had a longer career as a object curator at Landis Valley Museum, where I was curator of the agricultural collection and the tool technology collection. So I'm reaching back a little bit here, but I think it's interesting how I came to be involved in this. I was hired as a historian by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission in 1984. And that's when I began working in the Bureau for Historic Preservation. And it was an office that administered at the state level the National Historic or the National Register for Historic Places and the Investment Tax Credit Program and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, as well as the State Historic Preservation Act. And so we reviewed any use of public money or need for any kind of permitting. So I reviewed all kinds of things and traveled a fair amount around the state to look at various things and got involved in some really interesting projects. And we did a lot of help and advice to the public. And starting at some point, I think in the 1970s or 80s, the National Park Service began to publish a series of technical bulletins called preservation briefs. And at first they issued some of the ones for which there was a pretty obvious immediate need, things like how to clean masonry buildings. We wanted people to, they wanted people to stop sandblasting buildings, for example, to clean them, but to clean them with low pressure water and the gentlest means necessary to get the job done. And other preservation briefs in this technical leaflet series, like repointing masonry buildings, repairing wood windows. And what we found, because there are so many log buildings throughout not just Pennsylvania, but a lot of states in the Northeast, that we frequently got questions about how to preserve them. And there were too many times, and I don't mean this to be any reflection on your situation now, but there were too many times when people would say that they needed help restoring something, restoring a log building, and we would get to talking about how they might go about it, and not too far into the conversation, I learned that all that they had were the logs, sometimes stored in a trailer somewhere, and they had so none of the molding, none of the doors or detailing or foundation, or no archaeology was performed or anything. They just had just the logs. And I said to my boss, my supervisor at the time, Jim Caulfield, who had worked for the National Park Service and was a preservation architect, I said to him, I wonder why the National Park Service has never done a technical leaflet on log buildings, because it's such a basic building construction medium. I wonder why they haven't done that. And having worked for the National Park Service and been a preservation architect in private practice, he said to me, well, why don't you write one? And as I noted before, I was not a preservation architect, but I was a lowly historian, okay, who picked up a lot of preservation experience on the job. So I was pretty adept at reading plans and specifications, things that I can still quote, water pressure and gallons flow per minute when cleaning buildings and all of that stuff. It's pretty deeply ingrained. And so I wrote a prospectus for this, and we sent it to the Park Service. Some contacts were my boss still had in Washington, the Park Service office in Washington, D.C. And I got a call back, and the person who eventually became my editor, National Park Service corroborating partner and editor, said to me right away, "You're not an architect." And I thought, uh-oh. But then she said, "I know that because you can write really well." So that's kind of how it got started. And it was the first technical bulletin in the Preservation Brief series to have come from the bottom up, or from the state office up, and not to have been generated at the level of the federal government or by somebody that was commissioned by the federal government to do. And even though the technical bulletins are titled preservation briefs, meaning that they're supposed to be short, it ended up being the longest one to date, because they held me to going on and talking about things like foundations and cellars and roofs on log buildings, and windows and whole building systems. And so when I read back through it, I think about some of that, the editing and the work that I did with the National Park Service. I also found that there were one or two individuals within the National Park Service who were unhappy that they were not asked to do this, and one or two people in private practice who did a lot of hands-on work with log buildings that were also not happy that they weren't commissioned or asked to do this. So that was a little bit of a battle working with those folks. But because all of these kinds of things, when they're done, are sent out for peer review, we certainly asked all of those people to be involved, and I think we ended up with a pretty good product. And it was a technical bulletin, like all the rest in the series, that we could just pop in the mail and send out to people. Now, for some time, this has been available online. So any of you that haven't viewed it, you can simply go to the National Park Service website and go to technical assistance and pull up any one of the preservation briefs and find number 26 on log buildings. And So I thought you might enjoy that background on that. So I'm going to proceed here through a PowerPoint of slides that I have. And I titled this first one, Romance of the Logs, because as I had said to you before, a lot of people saw the entire value of the log building as just being inherent in the logs, and public misconceptions about thinking that all colonists, when they came, started out building and living in log buildings, was something that was proven not to be true as early as the 1930s. There was a historian, Harold Shurtleff, who was of Scandinavian background and interested in just what culture first built log buildings in America, or first brought them in. And he found out that it was the Swedes and Finns, as some of you might already know, on the lower Delaware. And the British didn't really have this horizontal log building tradition. They had deforested a lot of the acreage in what's now the United Kingdom. And except for defensive works like blockhouses and things like that, the British did not build when they first came in that way. And they tended to build huts, or use at the very first generation things like overhangs and things like that. But then as soon as they could, they erected what we now call half timber buildings, or in German culture you call Fachwerk, which is timber with a wattle and daub, either woven sticks or some other kind of nogging or chinking to fill in between those the timbers. And as you're probably well aware, political candidates like Harrison and Lincoln and others touted the fact that they came from or lived at one time in humble log cabins. And so that did a lot to add to the whole mystique. And the thing, I guess, ultimately is we want to make sure that people are looking at the whole structure and its site and its context, and that they're not just saving the logs, but they're saving things that have that exhibit or document some of the history of the building, whether that's the architectural style or changes that were made to it, or whatever. So let's proceed through these. This is a building that was out in Franklin County. And this was a building that somebody had rehabilitated as an income producing property in an attempt to get the preservation tax credit. And they were ultimately denied the tax credit. And this was a log building. And I'm not going to name it, but you can see that it had a number of different generations of covering. So there was some early clapboard on there, and maybe some later clapboard, and then some of that pressed asphaltic shingling that I think by trade name was called insel brick, sort of made to look like brick, and had this really relatively massive end chimney, and you can see the double decked porch there, or gallery. And so the building had quite a bit of character. Condition was not all that good. A building can have really good integrity, but have poor condition, and vice versa. You can even see on that second floor inside the that gallery area that the wall was stuccoed. And so there's oftentimes this urge to, once logs are discovered, to just tear off everything and get down to those all important logs and throw everything else away, get it out of there. And one needs to do their homework. And of course, you need to document, always photograph, document this project from start and during and to the end, and then periodically thereafter. And what unfortunately, this, when it was all done, this was the product, and the National Park Service was not happy with it. I mean, it's a nice, clean, crisp, completed project, and it does show the logs to their full advantage. But probably, if a person were to approach this from a preservation standpoint, they would try to look at trying to figure out when those different layers were added. And I'm not suggesting that everything should have been kept, but perhaps that clapboard that was on there and the stucco on the second floor are some of the sidings that should have been kept. A lot of the log houses in Pennsylvania, especially those that with the corner notching that doesn't have the extended crowns, were notched very tightly and carefully that way, so that the logs could be protected and could be covered with some kind of siding or some other kind of stucco or something like that. So anyway, these folks were denied the preservation tax credit and were very unhappy about that. And then you can see also that the balustrade on the second floor level looks like it uses maybe modern pressure treated balusters. Clues to when a log building may have been sited. Look at how the window frame here projects past the plane of the log wall. Maybe this wasn't the original window frame, but clearly at some point the plan was to side this building. Now a higher style log house, and I'm sorry the slide's a little washed out here. What lies beneath the stucco in this case, we have logs with some pretty wide interstices there between the logs, and the chinking that is there, as you can see, are stones and mortar, and then some lath and stucco applied up in the gable. It strikes me that this building was in Chester County, and I have to tell you, I don't remember. I'm sure that some of you will know it and remember it. And I don't know what all of the research was that went into it, but again, just giving you an idea of different types of log buildings. This one has I believe a stone addition there on the right side. Another reason, and this is an 18th century building, you can see that characteristic pent eave there on the left gable. A lot of times log buildings were retained if they were a fairly sound structure, and with a growing family or a need to house retiring parents, or at the other end of the scale, newly married children, extending the house, making the house bigger, or just simply growth of your own family. People, in many cases, applied some siding or stucco to unify the expanded house. And you have to be thinking with their mindset, a log house in an era, especially in the early 19th century, when America was on the move upward already, and farmers in places like Berks County were selling a lot of wheat, selling a lot of grain, while Napoleon was trampling Europe. Wanted to adopt the newest styles architecturally, and they wanted their houses to look a little more sophisticated. You can see here, looking at this one, that the log ends, there's quite a bit of weathering. that suggests that this log was exposed pretty long, and that it had a long period when it was not covered. But look at this, look at the interior here, and you see a what's probably a federal style balustrade and newel post and balusters and string course there. It's in some cases when, if folks, especially when you're dealing with a higher style house, if you remove all of the historical vestiges of the families wanting to express their growing sophistication, express their growing status, and possibly their growing wealth by bringing some architectural style to their house that maybe had a log core, it can be pretty discordant to have the outside look like it's first generation beginning, and have other aspects of the house that have this kind of nice finish. This I'm trying to remember where this house was. Oh, this is the Lebanon, the Chestnut Street log house in Lebanon. This had been scheduled for demolition downtown. Original town lots in Lebanon sold in the 1750s, and this building has the classic form of a continental plan early log house from that period of original town lot construction, and that continental plan from continental Europe, typically in our area with Germanic influence, is often expressed in a window door on one of the long ends, and then inside a kuka or kitchen, a kammer or a pantry, and a stuba, which was the stove room where you had the 5-plate stove, which was fed embers from the fireplace on the other side. And they typically had a central chimney in them for warmth. Anyway, this building was scheduled for demolition, and it was discovered when an exterior chimney was taken off that it was an early log building. And you can see the notching here. You can see some of the clapboard on the left that I can tell you has not been saved or preserved. And then you can see some of the rotted out log ends, full dovetail notching. And this is the building as it is preserved today. And you can even see the date on my old slide there of 1993. And is actually one of the treasured pieces of the Preservation Trust of Lebanon County, one of the buildings that they do interpret. And they have had built a split pale or hand-riven fence around the garden, and do interpretation here. And it is not the only log building in downtown Lebanon, but it appears to be the only surviving mid-18th century continental plan house. And you can see they've also restored that larger size central chimney there, put that back. So just an incredible survival. And you've got the late 19th and early 20th century houses and row housing all around it. Pretty amazing survival. Stoop was added. And there's the street context of it. Now, that's a early log house in the prior one was in an urban context. This is the Knurr log house in a rural context, and I believe in Montgomery County, and as far as I know, it's still there. And you've got that same story and a half pattern there, and you have an internal chimney. And it had, at least the time when it was listed on the National Register, it had this really beautiful pastoral setting. And it had all of these outbuildings. You had a barn, shed, a little sheepfold, a pigsty, a privy, corn crib, other sheds, another foundation, and the house and the yard, garden, etc., drain. And you can see the relationships between the buildings. This is another thing to be concerned with when a log building is moved. There are all kinds of things that one might or might not recognize from the get-go about that context. Things like what direction was the log house facing? Was it facing the rising sun, where somebody could do some chores with good sunlight out on the front porch? Was it facing a non-windward side? How was it situated? Was it situated so the owner could see and keep an eye on the barn? Or if he had a little still shed, which sometimes were robbed, could he keep an eye on that? How were these buildings oriented toward each other? How were they oriented toward early roads and those kinds of things? And then, of course, any potential archaeology that was on the site in the builder's trench, and would express how and when the building was used. And here you can see where this is in relationship to the Perkiomen Creek, Limerick Township, Schwenksville, and it's that dark that property with the trapezoidal boundary up there next to Delphi. Now, small town context. This is a log building that was in the Lancaster County town of Mannheim. As you entered the town on the north side, and I took photographs of this building, and it had this really early wide clapboard. Instead of having a door and two windows, it had one window, but it's the same story and a half. And in the course of my time of when I was putting together the log brief, this building, which of course had been there since the 18th century, was taken down. And I thought for some time that it had been demolished, but actually it was moved very carefully and preserved on another street. The owner just did not want it there. And the local group, I don't know whether it was the Mannheim Area Historical Society, it might have moved it, I'm not sure. But anyway, it has been preserved, but it had down to the 1990s. It was situated right along Route 72 at a bend going into the north end of town, but it had incredibly preserved all of this horizontal wide clapboard siding on the front and on the north end, and then vertical board siding up in the gable. Documentation is something that's always very important. And this is a view of the town of Nazareth, an early Moravian town, somewhat upstate, moving up toward the Pocono area. And this is a building in, I believe it's in Nazareth, or it might even be in Emmaus, but a log building. And it's just another example of an early log building, one which has also been restored. There's a really neat dormer that you can see sweeping down there that makes one think of the dormers that are on the buildings at Erfurt Cloister. These are log ends that I would say were probably covered early on to protect them. Now, I don't know the full history of the restoration here. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the lower logs the bottom logs, by the way, are called sill, S-I-L-L, like windowsill. Sill logs that all the rest of the logs rest on. And of course, they're the ones that are most susceptible because of their closeness to the ground to insect damage and moisture and rot. I wouldn't be surprised if the bottom logs had been replaced or needed to be replaced during the restoration, and that's why the notching there the corners look so crisp. They might simply be newer logs. And this one is in my hometown in Annville, and a local artist purchased this one. And this is another example of one of these continental Germanic plan houses. And I don't remember what, and this artist and her family restored this house. And you can see how she either retained or reproduced the clapboard on the right end there of the house. I don't remember what was on the front, but she either retained or I think probably, knowing her, she retained whatever she could, repaired whatever was repairable, and then replicated what components of, say, the siding couldn't be. But this is right along Route 422. If one were to travel from Lebanon through Annville to the town of Hershey, you would pass this. And you can, there you can see some of the old clapboard and some log ends. And the need to shed the rain here, the downspout is going right into a rain barrel. This one, a mountain settlement, and I believe this is somewhere in the vicinity of Northampton County, I believe, and this was built on a ridge top. And look at this great documentation, an old photograph. When you're doing restoration projects, there's nothing like a historic photograph to help you along with your plans. And look at the way these folks have documented this all along the way. Document, document, document. Overall photographs for context, but then a number of detailed photographs with captions. You always, whether you're a preservation person, be it volunteer or a highly paid person, you always want to, or an academic historian, you always want people to be able to retrace your steps if need be, at least mentally, so they know why you made the decisions that you did along the way, and what the basis was for making these decisions. But well documented. And you can see some log ends here that are well weathered. It looks like they've got some of that V notching there. And one would also call, when we talk about log buildings, we're not just talking about buildings that have corner notching that forms four walls into what's known as a log pen, or just simply a four log walls joined together at the corners. You also find cases where you have a vertical end timber, and sometimes we'll have mortise and tenon joints that then might be pinned to keep them together. So in this case, we are talking about any technological system that keeps these horizontal log walls, holds them together. So you can see again here, these ends of the logs that extend past the notching are known as the crowns of the logs. And these are really weathered. Must be a really hard, durable wood that was used here. And then note here an example of what I said before. Look at the bottom. Look at the sill logs. the one coming in from the right and the one coming in from the left. I think that probably the one on the right was replaced. I think probably the one on the left, if you look farther back on the left margin behind the downspout, it looks like you have a weathered log. So in this case, I believe they just replaced the crown. And this is what you want to do. You want to keep as much of the historic fabric that you can. And with log buildings, there are two main ways this is done. One is you do an in-splicing, which are sometimes called Dutchman repairs or Dutchman splicing, where you're just you're cutting away rotted wood and you're forming some kind of a joint. And this will have to be done by by an experienced professional who can join these together. That's one method. And the extreme of that would be where you would need to replace the whole log, where you simply couldn't repair. You couldn't just put in an end piece or the crown. The whole log just really had to go. It was rotted, it was soft, it was sinking into the foundation. And sometimes this is done by using epoxy. Now, when I was working in preservation, epoxies that were something that were just really coming onto the scene and not in wide use as yet in the early to mid 1980s, but increasingly saw more and more use. And I found that in writing the log brief, I came across some repair people and technicians who were real purists. They didn't think you should ever use any epoxy on logs. If the log, you either kept it or you got rid of it, or if you spliced, you spliced. But there are situations where, for example, water may have gotten in through a joint and seeped behind the joint, and you might have the length of a log or more of the inside of the log really rotted, and you might have a well-weathered but hard outer part to the log. And in cases where you can do these repairs and the work is going to be hidden when you're done behind chinking, which is the solid blocking, whether it's wood or stones or whatever, and daubing, which is the stucco-like material that you seal between the logs and you cover that chinking. If you're doing a repair that's going to be hidden by the chinking and daubing, you don't really, if it's going to be an epoxy repair, let's say you're using a liquid epoxy and you are able to scoop out all of that rot, you can actually form up around that log and you can pour in, or if it's a paste type of epoxy, you can use some kind of a spatula or trowel to put that in. And this again is something that you at least need to have the training or supervision of a person experienced in working with timbers and with rot to perform. But it is maybe something that person can supervise or show others to do or oversee. But you definitely want a professional doing that. You don't want to just get in there and start gouging away. But things like embedding rods of metal, like a stainless steel or epoxy rods or whatever, sometimes that can be done to keep that structural integrity. So I wouldn't want to discount epoxy as a way in conjunction with splices where you need to, and in conjunction with maybe needing to have a whole new sill log made. So I think you need to be open to all of those things. Here you can see how some of the splices. They had not weathered at this point, Dutchman repair or splicing in or in splicing. And I think the overall effect, if you were to take those photographs that you saw at the outset, and you'd say that the character and the visual qualities of this building have been pretty well preserved. And you know, one would need to go up close and look to find these individual repairs. And that's now had about 30 years, those repairs, to acquire some patina and some weathering. This is the Downing House. I think his first name was John, the founder of Downingtown. And this was its context by the, I would say 1970s or so, by the time of the 80s. I guess the sign is at least that new. The road in front of the Downing House had been built up over the years. They had this commercial neighbor, which was a Chevrolet dealer. And so the house received the vibrations from all of the traffic that went by. It had the intrusion of the sign. It received the runoff water from the highway, from the sidewalk. And so it had some real problems. Through documentation, it was shown that the way these logs were protected was with whitewash. And I think this log house, this was a really early one. I think it is documented date to around 1700, I believe. But you can see the picket fence around it in way back. And this might be an African-American family living there. I'm not sure. And you can see this was probably a photo postcard with this caption below, log cabin on the Brandywine. And you can see a little bit of the whitewash that's on there. This building had a well-preserved interior with vertical plank partitions in it and wide plank flooring. And look at the exposed whitewashed joists in there. It looks like, at least in that room, it had never had a plaster ceiling. And this is what it looked like after the building was moved and restored. Now, this building, prior to any of this work, was listed on the National Register. And the folks in Downingtown wanted to make sure it stayed listed on the National Register. And one of the problematic things that can befall a building is if it has been moved or has been disassociated from its site. Those buildings generally are no longer eligible for the National Register. What these folks did was they very carefully did archaeology around the original site before they had done anything to the building. And they planned on moving it a minimal distance and keeping the relationship to the road. So they moved it somewhat back from the road, and they moved it onto somewhat higher ground. And they got all of this approved along the way by National Park Service architects and historians prior to doing this move. So, and if I didn't say so, they also did archaeology to perform archaeology on the intended site, so that they weren't destroying any, which wasn't very far away. So they weren't destroying any archaeological information that was there. And they just have a ton of materials that they found in the course of doing that. And put the whitewash that was documented through photographs back on the building. There you can see gable end before. Most of the whitewash really not really showing there, but look at those weathered logs. The gables had been covered with wide clapboard, and they preserved all of that they could. And you can see today, it still has that relationship with the rest of the town. it doesn't have that original rural context, but that's part of history and civilization and town growth. And as I said, it's been moved, but the National Register status has been retained. Whitewash is one of those things that is like paint, is a sacrificial layer. So it's expected that the weather and the freeze thaw and all of that is going to take it away gradually, and it's routine maintenance. And you will find that with the daubing that you have to put to cover the chinking between the logs. And again, another view. And another view. The car dealership is that building is still there. So you can see it hasn't been moved terribly far, but it doesn't have all of the drainage of the sidewalk right up against it. And that concludes the slides. I didn't go into things like detail as far as recipes for daubing, but that's something that you can find in the preservation brief. And I'd be glad if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them at this point. So Laura, I guess I'm turning it back over to you.
So we had a couple of questions already come in. And if you want to stop your screen sharing, that way we can see our faces a little bit bigger here. We have a question from George Ambrose, who asks, when do you use original materials for the chinking versus modern materials, and why would you use one or the other?
Well, I know since in your case, this was a building that you had to move in order to save it. You had to disassemble it in order to save it. I'm assuming that you don't have any of that chinking material, or do you have some of it?
We kept as much as we possibly could and documented where, well, there was quite a bit of wood chinking in the house that we worked on taking down, and documented where all of that was in the building. So
yeah, I would, if it's sound, I would reuse it, and especially if you know where it was, and you know, document putting it back, because that's going to be covered by the daubing. I would try and put use the same kind of chinking material, but I don't see any sense in going out and looking for old wood. In other words, if this was 200-year-old chinking, don't think that it's necessary for material that is going to be new anyway and is going to be covered up, that you need to go and a matter of fact, for the person that comes along in the future, but of course you will be documenting things, but think of that person in the future if records are lost and they find chinking in there that is 250 years old but came from some other location. We don't want to confuse people, and there are, and I didn't really get into this, there is a booklet or a set of standards that you might or might not be aware of called Standards for Rehabilitation. There's also standards for restoration that were published by the National Park Service, and they give some pretty good, just common sense guidance in doing that. But one of the things is that you never want to confuse or lay down things that could be false information, I think, for future. So I don't know if I'm answering that well enough. If a lot of the chinking are wooden blocks and you know where the small amount of original chinking was, try and put that back there, but try and use wood blocks elsewhere if you can, or but certainly don't go out and hunt up wood of the same vintage. I don't see,
Um,
wouldn't see a point in that.
Yeah, and our director, Tony Shahan, mentioned in the chat that much of the chinking for our log building was it was recycled architectural elements from other buildings, and they were originally exposed. We mapped and marked each of those pieces. Let's see. So Yvonne asks, were there cellars in these cabins?
Some yes and some not. You've all probably heard about how they would build close to a spring and sometimes over a spring if they could, because of course they didn't have refrigerators, and the water coming out of the ground was a place where they could set pottery jars of food and things like that to preserve them. But a lot of them just had crawl spaces, and the cellars maybe were dug later as needed. That log house, and you hear me using that word house. I'm not using cabin everywhere. Cabin is meant to be more of a term for something that's not a year-round dwelling and is thrown up fairly quickly, perhaps not even insulated. And a lot of these buildings were, in many cases, not even first generation, but second generation houses, and especially when the ends were squared like that so that they could receive clapboard or something else to protect the logs. I grew up in a farmhouse that had been added to, both raised a story and built on to the back, but it was a Germanic style house, and it was very much like these continental log houses, and it was door, window, and it had an arched root cellar that was not under the early part of the house. It was a the front part of it was a 1750s house. And so I'm sure in that case, that had its own bulkhead and was entered from outside in the backyard. And so especially in a rural context, that's what a lot of people did. And then later, if they could extend the house, they extended over that cellar. But many of them were also dug out after the house was built. So you're going to find all different situations, really.
And Yvonne also asked if you were involved with the new cabins built at Governor Prince Park.
No, I'm not. I can't comment on that at all. The only thing that I would say again about that is, be thinking about that early Scandinavian introduction of log buildings on the Delaware until the English, took over the settlement. Yeah, I'm not aware of them. When I was a college intern in architectural preservation, which would have been 1979 or 80, there was an argument going on in Southeast PA. There were two small log houses, or maybe in this case cabins, dating to the 1600s that were Scandinavian. The Upper Darby, they were along Darby Creek, and they were being vandalized. And one of the problems that I saw as an intern then, as a college intern, was there was a lot of arguing between local authorities. Some said that these were Germanic and some said no, these were Scandinavian. And a lot of critical time was lost trying to get the documentation right so that it could be listed on the register and receive more help and coalesce a group of volunteers to take care of them and keep watch over them. And the one was unfortunately trashed by vandals and no longer exists. I didn't get into other ethnic things, but the Scandinavians often had corner chimneys placed in the corner, and those were logs in the round with saddle notching at the corners.
Yes, a couple people have mentioned the lower Swedish cabin in Delaware County, and encourage folks to go check that out. Let's see. Tony asked if you could talk a little bit more about the qualities of whitewash used on.
I don't know that I'm trying to think whether there's a formula for that. I don't think there's a formula in the log brief. So I couldn't quote you a formula for that, but you're using obviously lime and water. One of the things about that is the hairline cracks that develop in that are to a bit of a degree self-healing because the rain, when it washes over, as far as the hairline cracks, can oftentimes reseal them. And that's also gets into one of the issues with using too much Portland cement in the daubing. Portland cement is very hard, has a very different coefficients of expansion with wood, and cracking both in repointing of brick and stone and use in daubing for log buildings will often happen, and cracks in that are not self-sealing. So whether you're pointing historic masonry or you're doing a daubing mix, and there are, I think, two formulae in the log brief. I just have a Xerox copy here, but I think they're in the back.
I did put the link to the electronic version into the chat. So
okay,
if
good.
Folks can click on that to go and check it out for themselves. George, one commented that the upper Swedish cabin actually was burned.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then he also asked, how common are log cabins with additions of only 3 of their own walls that are joined to the original pen?
I'm not quite sure what you mean there. You mean having a log pen where they remove one wall and then build a house on?
I think maybe what he is asking is where the addition only has 3 walls that are joined to the original part of the structure without having another addition or a vertical beam like we saw in a couple of those.
I couldn't say how common or uncommon they are, but that slide that I showed of the one that I said was up kind of on the mountaintop, that was up toward the Poconos, when I was talking about the juncture there with a vertical timber, and then the other logs seemed to be let into that vertical timber, and it butted up right up against the corner that had notched logs. So you would certainly see that quite a bit. Sometimes you'll even see like stone addition, where they'll keep the log building that's really sound and put a stone addition on it, and people will assume, oh, the stone, that's got to be the oldest, and it isn't necessarily. And a lot of those more resistant, rot resistant woods like chestnut and white oak, if they are sufficiently, if the roof is always replaced in time and your foundation isn't sinking, I mean, they can really last quite a while. And in any kind of restoration or rebuilding, you want to have a minimum of about 8 inches between the sill log and the ground, and always have good positive drainage away from the building. Some termites will actually, they don't travel over open ground, but they will actually some cases build mud tunnels to reach wood and travel through those tunnels. So if that wood is close enough to the ground, those little buggers will do that.
We have just a few comments. One, Michael Knight, who was partly involved, he's one of our board members and was partly involved in the taking down the Newlin house. It was definitely not one of those first generation cabins. It's, you know, a more substantial structure, and it does have a cellar, did have a cellar that seems to have had a hearth, if not originally, at least at some point. Yes, Tony, our director, says the Newlin longhouse had squared logs over a basement kitchen, and the logs were infilled with chinking, and there was evidence of a clay floor on top of the logs and chinking. And he asked, how common is this technique with a log floor with chinking and clay then on top? Is that something that you've come across?
So those logs were directly on a clay. They were laid on like what they would call sleepers.
So the there's a full basement underneath, and then the logs were on the sills, and then had packed in between the floor. They essentially made the floor joists, but packed in between
as an insulating layer.
Yeah, and then
I've heard of that before.
Yeah. Do you have any sense of how common that was?
I don't, and I don't know if it was a regional thing, but I have heard of it before and seen photographs of it.
Michael also mentions that one of the Upper Darby cabins that you talked about is now the township roadmaster lot. And Elizabeth McCarrick said that the Swedish farmstead at Governor Prince Park is a reconstruction of a village that was built in New Jersey, and it was done in the 1980s to represent a Swedish farmstead. It was going to be demolished, and Tinicum was lucky enough to get the building. Norman Glass mentions a soft daubing will tend to move with the building and not crack as much.
Wow, Norman Glass. Norman Glass is that's a name. That's an important preservation name.
Well, he's here tonight.
I think I met him once.
I think we covered all the questions that we had here and all the comments. So I want to thank you, Bruce, for joining us tonight and giving us some insight on log construction, and thank everybody who joined us as attendees as well. We will be having another Newlin series program next month. We'll have Lauren McGrath from Willistown Conservation Trust, who will be speaking about local watersheds. It will also be on Zoom. It's on May 22nd. It's a Sunday at 3 p.m. And the recording of this session will also be on our website, hopefully later this evening, if it downloads properly. And you can also register for upcoming Newlin series programs on the website as well. I'll pop that into the chat before we all sign off.
You can feel free to share my work email too, if there are more questions.
All right, yeah, we'll put that on the website right under the video. All right, so I just dropped the newlingristmill.org /the-Newlin-series. Our lots of thank yous and very interesting discussion. So again, thank you, Bruce. And we will probably be picking your brain at some point again as we continue on in the restoration process. All right,
okay,
thanks so much, everyone, and have a good evening. Great.
Okay,
Bye.
good luck, folks. Bye-bye.